We're going to be in Exodus 20. Last week we looked at those first four of the commandments that have to do mainly with man's relationship with God. And this week we're going to look at the other six that have mainly to do with man's relationship with other people. The list is almost identical to the list in Deuteronomy 5. We kind of cross-referenced a little bit of that last week, so we won't go over to Deuteronomy 5 tonight and look at those. But if you compare them side by side, they're almost word for word in these final six. I'm going to start in verse 12. Exodus 20 and verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. What is the reason, if there has to be a reason, that God would put this first in the list of things about society, about how human beings treat each other? Why lead off with honor your father and your mother? Well, let me ask you this. Which is more powerful, at least in the back of our minds, President Biden said, or my mama said? My mama said, right? The same thing is true when it comes to church. There are lots and lots of folks that I've encountered through the years that hold all kinds of wild and wonderful doctrines that have nothing to do with Scripture, but they hold them anyway because my mama said, right? And it's always been that way. Strange things like what kind of shoes do you wear to church? Right? When I was a kid, you had school shoes and you had church shoes. And you didn't wear your church shoes to school and you didn't wear your school shoes to church. Why? Because mama said, right? And there didn't have to be a book, chapter, and verse. Mama said. And so a lot of us were raised with a mixture of what Scripture says and what Mommy and Daddy say. And a lot of times they coincided, hopefully, in our homes, that Mom and Dad were giving us what Scripture gave us. But there was always that filter, right? There was a filter of God said through Mom and Dad to us. And so honor your father and your mother changes society for the better. As long as society is where it needs to be to begin with, if you honor your father and mother, if you do the things that Mom and Dad said do, then society remains about the same. When you begin to go against what Mom and Dad said, or we'll broaden that, what the older generation says, you end up with all kinds of things changing. Now we can look in our lifespan, probably most of us, and see a change point along about the late 1950s, early 1960s. There was a change point. There was an attitude shift. Don't trust anybody over 30. Right? So your mom and your dad are not on the trusted list when that statement comes out. Politicians at that point were striving to kind of stem the flood. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Right? Keep this idea that there's something more important than the individual. And then we creep over into the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and that me generation, that thinking that, well, I'll do what Mom and Dad say as long as I think it's in my best interest. That kind of thinking creeps in more and more. And in the business world, in the church, in politics, younger suddenly becomes the thing. Right? We want younger, more forward thinking. We don't want to look back to our history. We want to look forward to our future. So I don't know that God put this one in this particular place for that reason, but everything that comes behind it needs to be reinforced by parents. Right? Everything from honor your father and mother on down lives and dies by how well we honor father and mother. If their traditions are in line with God's commands, then honoring father and mother is absolutely essential. All right, let's keep going. Verse 13, you shall not murder. Back a couple of years ago, I taught my last class in ethics. And in the ethics class, we would ask the question, how does that actually apply? Right? What can we do with that? And one of the exercises we did was to take the negative 10 commandments, the 8 of them that are negatives. There's this one, honor father and mother, and remember the Sabbath day. Those are the only 2 that are stated positively. Do this. The rest of them are don't do this. So you get to don't murder. What does don't murder mean in real life? Well, to a degree, it means don't kill us. Right? The Israelites are in the desert, and it's not going to be long before they start having ongoing warfare with different groups that are from that area. When they get into Canaan, one of the first things they're told to do at Jericho is to wipe out everybody. So it doesn't mean that there is no one who needs to die, but it does mean that you don't have the right to decide who that is. Right? You don't take upon yourself the act of killing other humans. When I gave it to the class and said, how do we state that in a positive way? They said, well, we think that the statement, all humans are created with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That we should honor life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in all other humans. It says about the same thing. Honor life is the opposite of, or falls in line with, don't murder. But again, it's a question when you run into people serving as police officers. Can a police officer kill someone in the line of duty, or is that thou shalt not kill? Does that violate that? A soldier going to war, does that violate thou shalt not kill? I've met one individual in my life who was what I would believe to be a total pacifist. I married him to a young lady that grew up in the church there in Alva, and really enjoy this young man. He's a wonderful young man. They have a wonderful family together. But he would not have fought had he been drafted. He would have been a conscientious objector. He would probably have had to do some time back in the day if he had lived far enough back. But his group, his mama, his family held very strongly to that interpretation of thou shalt not murder or thou shalt not kill. The New Testament gives us a little bit more insight when Paul talks about the right of the government to wield the sword, so that you have to have someone with enough power, enough fear-inducing power to make people do what's right. It's one of the problems with the current campaign to defund the police. In big cities in particular, if you don't have someone to step in and to make people do what they need to do, or if you take away from the ability to protect themselves while they're doing so, puts everybody in a difficult situation. But anyway, thou shalt not murder. Recognize the rights of other people to live, to have life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness. The next one, don't commit adultery. Honor the rights of other people to have their own spouses. That's what they came up with to describe that. Adultery is one of those that our country has decided is not a thing much anymore. You can still be divorced for cause of adultery. You specifically have to put that in the paperwork. You have to kind of work that to make sure that it says that if you want that to be the reason. But as far as the nation in general, we almost turn a blind eye toward adultery. One of the reasons being that some of our favorite heroes and heroines and movie stars and politicians have been in and out of marriages so many times that we want to cut them a break. We want to say, well, adultery is, they really loved each other. I've had people sit in my office for counseling and tell me that God wouldn't hold me responsible for being with this person because he wants me to be with them because I love them. And you're committing adultery. So that kind of blind eye to adultery has got us over a barrel in this country. But thou shalt not commit adultery is the willingness to realize that people have the right to sacred institutions of marriage. That I can't interfere with that, I can't step between that, I can't undo that, because they have that right before God to be duly married, and unfortunately, our generation is less likely. Oh, the divorce rate has gone down, right? So we could celebrate that. We were under 50% for a while. I'm not sure exactly where we are now. But the reason that we're under 50%, people just don't get married anymore. So that when I was a kid, I had to have somebody explain this to me. Fornication, that's our King James word that means any kind of sexual immorality. And then adultery involves someone who's married. Right? So when you look in the New Testament and you see Paul talking about fornication and adultery, fornication is the broad brush stroke, and adultery is the smaller circle around those that are married when they commit sexual immorality. Don't steal. Okay? Respect the rights of others to own personal property. Our country should be really good at this. There are countries in the world where personal property is looked at as a bad thing, right? Everything belongs to the government, and people are doled out the things that the government feels like they need. But in our country, we have the right to personal ownership. Right? We buy things, we register things in our name. We have property, and we register the property in our name. And if someone comes and takes those things that are ours, then we have legal recourse. They took my stuff, and I want my stuff back, or at the very least, I want the people who took my stuff to be punished for taking it. So most people are in favor of thou shalt not steal, at least when it pertains to somebody taking stuff from me. Taking stuff from you is less interesting to me than taking stuff from me. But our country does enforce laws on personal property, and so did the Jewish nation. When God put these laws into place, it honored marriage, thou shalt not commit adultery. It honored personal property. It honored personal life. God gave them a set of regulations that showed that people matter and their rights matter. He didn't state them the same way as our Constitution states them, but they're very similar in their importance and in their scope. Okay? You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. I like where this one falls because we've got don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. And then the next one is don't bear false witness, which basically is saying don't lie and say that someone else did those other things if they didn't. What do we call it in our system? If you go to court and you lie. Perjury, right? Committing perjury. And in our country, it is punishable. Right? You can get some kind of fine, some kind of jail time for perjuring yourself, depending on, I guess, how big the case was or how big the lie was. But in the Jewish state, same thing. They could be punished for bearing false witness. When Jesus was taken early in the morning to Annas and Caiaphas, they kept bringing people in to bear witness against him. Right? And they kept coming up with all kinds of different stories. There was probably some false witness going on. There was probably some perjury going on in that little kangaroo court of theirs. But to my knowledge, none of those people were ever held accountable because it was the government, it was the leading spiritual people of Jerusalem who put them up to it. So again, if you've got the right person telling you to commit perjury, sometimes there's less of a propensity to hold you responsible for it. But don't murder, don't steal, don't kill, don't lie, and say that other people have done those things. In the Jewish system, it was difficult to bear false witness by yourself. Because in the Jewish system, you had to have two credible witnesses to even bring a case. And you had to have 3 if you really wanted an open and shut case. So if 2 people come and tell the same story, then they would both be perjuring themselves if it was a lie. So this is one of those things where more than one person might have been involved in lying. But again, if one person did and then the other 2 came forward and said, oh no, this one's lying, then you don't just have a case of adultery, you've got a case of adultery and a case of perjury all being taken care of at the same time. And then 17, which is really a wide-ranging statement. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, or his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. What does coveting mean? There's different levels to this thing. There's the idea of admiring. Right? We look at something that someone else has, and we say, well, I like that. Becky and I are always watching the travel trailers that come through, right? We like this style, we don't like that style, slide outs, no slide outs. How old are they? Do they have 2 axles or 1 axle if it's a trailer? All those kind of things. We're always evaluating all of the stuff that comes through town. And Shamrock has a lot of stuff that comes through town. You go down to, what's the gas station with the big C on it? Is that Sefco? Go down to Sefco. And I mean, you can't hardly get in the parking lot for all the different trailers. So we look at them, I like that, I don't like that, I like that, I don't like that. That's just admiration. There's nothing wrong with admiration. Then there's jealousy. Jealousy where we think, you know, I really wish that I had that. It pains me that that person has that and I don't have that. Okay? That's a shade in the wrong direction. And then you get to coveting. Coveting is, how can I get my hands on that? So I admire it, I would like to have it, I figure out how I can get it. Jesus uses that same kind of reasoning in the Sermon on the Mount. Run over to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. You know that section where he talks about different problems in our lives, divorce, adultery, anger, murder, right? And he says, you've heard it said by those of old, thou shalt not kill. But I say to you, and then he gives you these levels. And, you know, it gets a little worse. You're angry at your brother without a cause, and then you badmouth your brother, and then you call your brother unworthy or unfit, or he doesn't deserve to live. All of that, you know, one right after another. Adultery. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Now, is it okay to admire the beauty of a woman? Well, sure. There are some women who work really hard to look presentable in public. It's fine to admire the way they look. It's fine to admire the way they behave themselves. When we were living in Alva, there were a lot of ladies from the Friends community, and they were in their community. They wear long dresses and little head coverings, right? And I admire those women because of their dedication to being plain in public, right? Their desire to honor their husband by living that way. I find that wonderful, right? I admire them. That's fine. The next level, though, is to be jealous. I wish that was my woman. And then, of course, to go beyond that is to move into the area of adultery, either emotional adultery or physical adultery. But it starts with coveting. Right? Go over to Romans chapter 7. This is one of those passages that I like to read because it makes me feel better about myself. Paul had problems. And, you know, this is one of the greatest apostles who ever lived. Did a tremendous job of taking the gospel to the Gentiles. We're going to start in verse 7. Romans 7, verse 7. And, of course, we'll get to this on Sunday mornings here before long in class. But here's what Paul has to say. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Well, certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life, and I died. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and righteous, and good. So he says, I realize that the law of Moses, the Ten Commandments, are good things. He said, but when I look at them, they convict me, which is what they were meant to do. They were meant to tell the people, you're not right before God. You need God. You need God's mercy. You need God's grace. Same thing for us. We need to understand that Christ died for us, not just to make us feel like, how unworthy I must be that God had to send his own son to die for me, but that hope of being cleansed from it by his sacrifice. But when you start dwelling on the question of, have I ever coveted? You can find lots of examples. Right? Have I ever hated somebody so much that I wanted to do them in? You might be able to even find some record of that. Have I ever lusted after somebody? Well, yeah, we could come up with that too. So there's all kinds of things that we've done in our lives that violate these Ten Commandments. And Paul says the answer to all of this, the problem of sin, the answer is Jesus. Right? What did the Israelites know about Jesus? Nothing. Right? They didn't know Messiah yet. So imagine being one of that first group, and remember that the first time that this law was given, God was doing the talking. It just terrified the people. So not only is the law convicting them, so that every time he says, you must not murder, you must not steal, you must not covet, all of these people are in the valley going, oh, that's me, that's me. Oh, there's another one. How does he know that? How does he know I'm all those things? And as God is speaking it, they're just terrified. Why? Well, one thing, he had to build a new community. He had to build a group of people that were going to be law-keeping people. Had to treat each other well. They had to know how to be in community with one another, how that worked. So he gave them guidelines. But beyond that, he gave them a reason to understand how much they needed him. That he fed them, he clothed them. That's something we haven't talked about yet. 40 years in the desert, their sandals never wore out, their clothes never wore out. It's a God thing. They need to know that they need me. Not just physically, but they need to know that they've got spiritual problems. And their spiritual problems need to be fixed by me as well. So the law is partially a way to form community and to form laws where people can live together, and partially to convict them of the fact that they're never going to be able to do it perfectly, and they're always going to need the God that called them up out of Egypt. So those two things translate well to our situation, I think. It may be that tonight we can encourage you by a public response in some way. We'd love to do that as we sing.